Thank you, Neville. Thanks to everybody. First of all, thanks to Srini. It's always a great pleasure to listen to Srini, and he's a tough act to follow. So those of you who didn't get a nap in after lunch, feel free now. But as an agricultural water policy specialist, I used to be considered the chimeric offspring of heresy and lunacy when about 10 to 15 years ago I began to promote small farmers as a value-driven business and to promote a trade-based concept of water and food security. And I was considered completely insane when I said, wouldn't fodder be great as an irrigated crop for small farmers? But how that conversation has changed through the lifetime of ILSSI and how ILSSI has contributed to that. And I think the forum that we've just enjoyed, some of us, most of us at the World Bank, could be a potential game changer. And it's a privilege to be part of this changing game. And, you know, Claudia referred to the World Bank's cynicism when she talked about Mickey Mouse irrigation. It's our challenge now to change the conversation to become talks about Mighty Mouse irrigation, another cartoon character. So it's a great privilege to have been part of this, and thanks to IMI, particularly Tim, for his invitation, to AID and the team for allowing me to be part of that. I think it's fair to say, I'm sure the EAC members would agree, that some significant progress has been made as ILSSI has evolved over this stage, and the results are already very, very, very encouraging. And they're not yet a silver bullet, but they're certainly a sharp stake at this stage. And I think we're nailing the vampire of old concepts and old ideas, and we're moving forward. Now, Neville has asked me to use this session not just to speak to the title of the session, but also to speak to some of the issues and opportunities that must be addressed to enable the private sector development to support small-scale irrigation. And rather than waste time lecturing on that, I've crafted a suite of questions that I hope reveal my thinking on that. And by the way, when I'm talking about the private sector in this context, I'm including the small farmers as part of the private sector. But that's enough about me. Let's move on to the panel. This is about the panel. And what I'd like you all to do is very quickly introduce yourself by saying who you are, why you're important to this panel, and why this panel is important to you. Very quickly, Kurt.
Yes, hi. Hi, good afternoon. I'm Kurt Reinsma. Not quite sure why I'm important to this panel. I did grow up on an irrigated farm in eastern Montana, if that helps. But actually, I feel at a bit of a disadvantage. I don't know very much about irrigation, and I have not been able to partake of any of the previous sessions at the World Bank or this morning. That said, I've devoted a fair bit of time to trying to figure out how can we as a public sector agency, USAID, best work to facilitate and build the presence or the capacity for private investment in Africa and elsewhere. So I'm coming at it from a very broad kind of private sector engagement, private sector facilitation perspective, and maybe the best thing I can do is try to ask some of the right questions.
Okay. Yep. So again, I wasn't, introduced this morning, but I'll say it again. Nicola Four from International Water Management Institute, and I'm working on the Innovation Lab, the ILSSI project, for the last few years. And it's always difficult to ask what value you bring to something, but I'm hoping that I can bring some of the experience and some of the knowledge and results from ILSSI, and also from other projects we've been working on related to developing smallholder business models for irrigated agriculture. And I'm glad to be asked to be part of the panel because I think that we are on the cusp of recognizing the importance of the private sector to this, but I also think it's a really complex problem. For me, it's a really satisfactory and rewarding to be part of that discussion.
Thanks. I'm Tim Pruitt. I'm the CEO of IDE, International Development Enterprises, and similar to our moderator, IDE was considered absolutely crazy when we started to use a private sector approach to increasing farmer income. Since then, in the 35 years, we've reached about 30 million people with a product or a service, including drip irrigation, water pumps, and other agricultural technologies, as well as wash products like filters, and latrines. And this panel is important to me because I think all of these events, yesterday's event and today's event, it's just very exciting to see the increased attention on such a proven aspect of livelihoods. This is a known way to grow incomes. It's challenging, but we find it's worth the effort, so it's very exciting to be part of it.
I am Martin Fisher, the CEO of Kickstart International, and I'm interested and happy to be on this panel because Kickstart's a nonprofit that designs and promotes and sells very low-cost irrigation pumps across sub-Saharan Africa. We work in 16 countries. We've sold over 315,000 of our moneymaker human-powered pumps. It's helped about 1.2 million people to take a major step out of poverty.
This is not an advertising opportunity, Martin.
But we know that the most sustainable and scalable way to reach farmers, of course, is to sell through the local private sector. So we use the private sector to manufacture and sell pumps and spares and work with partners to reach farmers. And the reason that I'm happy to be here is because, of course, irrigation really is the best way for millions of farmers across Africa to get out of poverty. And we have to move from about 4% irrigated to about 15 to 20% irrigated if Africa wants any hope of feeding itself in the coming years. And that's only going to happen if we have vibrant private sector supply chains. And that's what we're talking about. So that's it.
Linda.
Well, my name is Linda Komboka. I am a founder and director at MFarm Limited. Why I'm important to this panel is because I've been working with farmers for 7 years. I've only managed to reach 30,000 farmers because agribusiness is quite an expensive venture, and we have to accept that. So why this panel is important to me is because I have awesome people on here. I mean, reaching 30 million people, I mean, that's amazing. But also to bring the conversation around irrigation playing like a bit into the 360 degrees experience in running an agribusiness, especially for the farmer. So this is part of looking at the whole supply chain in agribusiness. That's why this panel is important to me.
Thank you, everybody. Now, moving on to the questions. I've clustered the questions into 3: concepts, production, finance, and trade. We may not have time to get through them all, but we're not going to take questions from the plenum. Neville has already explained that there'll be a session later. However, if any of you think that the conversation is accelerating towards the edge of a cliff, I will invoke the 2-hand rule. You have to go like this, and I will listen to you, and so will the panel. So then the first set of questions, I'm going to read 4 questions in a moment, and then the panel, I will moderate a discussion about them between the panel. So if we can agree that there are 4 categories of player that we need to think about: producers, the state, development partners, and a very heterogeneous private sector involving consolidators, transporters, retailers along the supply chain, investors, and financial service providers. If we can agree that, who should be responsible for which bit of support along the value chain to the small farmers? What benefits could they reasonably expect from that participation? What is the best combination of these players and their inputs and support to mobilize the entrepreneurial skills of the African farmer? And what is the best way to minimize and mitigate the perceived risks of both producers and investors? Who's going to take that first?
How long do we get to
Easy
talk?
one.
Tim, the easy one.
Well, let me start with a very short comment about adoption of new technology. We all know in our own lives we buy new technologies to make our lives easier. We all have incredible phones that nobody had 20 years ago. So then we have to look at this process of how people buy, why people buy, and what they adopt, and how much does it cost to introduce a new product to a market. Now, when you're in the United States, you have this incredible market-based infrastructure that makes it incredibly easy to introduce new products as long as you have a product that delivers value. So then there's this old saying from the 1950s, if you build a better mousetrap, I don't know why mice have featured so much in these last 2 days, but anyways, if you build a better mousetrap, then the world is going to beat a path to your door. And I think for those of us that have spent time working in parts of Asia, sub-Saharan Africa, places where remote farms are not served, where, you know, in your village, you can go down and you can buy a Coca-Cola, a mobile phone scratch card, maybe some candy or some flour or something like this, you know, you can't accept that you just introduce a product and it magically flows to the people at the last mile. And so therefore, the costs of introducing a new product to the developing world are astronomically higher than it would be if you did it in, say, this country. And if you take that as a point of departure, and then you look at the vast majority of purveyors of technology to the developing world, they usually spend most of their time describing how effective their product is, without actually looking at that supply chain and the costs of delivering it in a sustainable way. So I'll just kick off with that comment. It did
Thank
not
you.
answer your question, admittedly, but at least it gets us rolling maybe.
But
No,
you
I'll
added some
follow up
value
on
to
it.
you added some value to my question. No, Martin, I'll get you in a minute. Kurt, you must have a response to that.
I was just going to respond to the part of the question about sort of the best combination, you know, what's appropriate public, what's appropriate private. And I think it's really important to get beyond a theoretical sort of academic construct. In order to figure that out, you've got to really, really dig in and work with private sector, private companies. You've got to stratify who you're talking about. It's, as everybody says, it's not a monolith. Sometimes when we in AID circles, we say, well, have you talked to the private sector? And to me, I have this mental image of some company in Illinois talking about expanding their markets, and somebody around the table says, well, have you talked to government? You know, it's a little bit of a meaningless question to say, have you talked to the private sector, unless you stratify who you're talking about. Are you talking about technology companies? Are you talking about importers? Are you talking about processors? And then you got to know who in the company you're supposed to be talking to. So it requires a very strategic process, I think, to think that through, to figure it out, and then work together to getting toward the answers. So let's move from the theoretical to the practical as we look for ways to engage, and then we can sort out who can best help who in what role. One very quick last point, which is that, you know, we in government and public sector funded activities talk a lot about we can't do it without the private sector. The private sector is also saying we can't do it without government.
Brilliant.
And so it's really important that both
Because
sides of that
from
question
about your
play.
second word, another question occurred to me for you that you'll want also to respond to. Do you agree that the lines are blurring now between the public and private sector as we have instruments like PPPs and blended finance? Kurt?
Yeah, I'm not sure I would describe it as the lines are blurring, but there's definitely a recognition on both sides that as private companies see the need for a social license to operate, respond to consumer pressures, and look for new market opportunities in emerging markets, they recognize that they've got to play in a broader way than they did in the past. And on the public side, we're definitely recognizing that we're not going to get there unless we truly engage the private sector.
So then, Martin, where do you see the pressure points on the supply chain? And what do you think about training your customers?
Well, there's plenty of pressure points on the supply chain, the biggest one being the one that Tim has so elegantly talked about here, which is that the cost of introducing the technology is extremely high, the cost of behavior change is extremely high, and this is really where the state and the development partners have to come in with smart time-bound subsidies to build that market demand and enable the smallholders to access these technologies. And if you think about what it is for the state, you know, part of it is, of course, extension services, and part of it actually is financing to build that market demand, incorporate irrigation into school and college curricula, direct market support subsidies have to go in there, loan guarantees for financial lenders. There's so many things. And, of course, they can also purchase and sell on a subsidized price irrigation technologies to seed the market. And then they have to build the infrastructure. We can't do this. One of the reasons the price is so high is because we don't have rural roads and electrification. And then the policies to support it. And so there's a lot that the state has to do, but they can't do it alone either. Just like the private sector can't do it alone, the state can't do it alone, and they also need the development partners to kick in now with financing. And again, it's funds to support this promotion and market building. and even help to develop new appropriate technologies and business plans. States in Africa probably don't do that. We need donor funds to do that. And things like loan guarantee funds to the banks and MFIs. So there's a very big role to be played by the state and the development partners in terms of these sort of smart, time-bound subsidies.
So then, Martin, I'm going to get on to you in a moment, Linda. I want you to start thinking about how your lady farmers would answer those questions. But Martin, how much advantage would be gained if the farmers were not only supplying the value chains but had equity in some of the value chains?
I think it's a nice idea, but very difficult for the farmers to have equity in the value chains. The farmers,
Why?
The farmers
Wow,
are
why?
very well. The farmers are very good at their farming, and creating value chains with farmer equity is just a complex thing to do. And so I think we want to encourage the farmers to do their farming. Most of the value chains, to be honest, they're going to sell into are going to be very, very local value chains for high-value fruits and vegetables, just as we've seen today. And so, you know, they have the equity in their farm. Even getting the equity in the pump is a big enough challenge.
But what about an example that I could give you from Kenya, where some farmers with a dairy, a group of farmers with a dairy, already have an established value chain, butter, yogurt, and ice cream. They're now investing in irrigation to boost their fodder supply.
Yeah, I think we can have examples where a private company that's doing processing is part of the story. But for the vast majority of farmers, that's not going to be the case. I think we can talk about, you know, tens of thousands like that. But we need to be talking about the millions. And for the millions of farmers, we're going to be talking about farmers producing, selling into very local markets.
So the issue of scale has come up a lot in the past 2 or 3 days. Let's park that one for a minute. Linda, how would your lady farmers answer those questions? What do they see? What do they need in terms of a combination of the state development partners and the private sector?
I believe the government has had a lot of resources in setting up systems and processes through which the private sector actually works. For instance, when Martin talks about extension services, you find that lots of young people are graduating from campus. They're getting these jobs which they're not very happy with, and you find them moving away from the rural areas and supporting the farmers and trying to get other jobs and alternative kind of income-generating activities. Whereas these are actually legitimate ways in which the government can actually say, look, we have set up extension service workers, we have trained them. So how do we work with the private sector to make sure that we're utilizing them to give this support to the farmers? Then I kind of disagree when we say that it will be difficult for the vast majority of the farmers to hold equity along the supply chain, because when farmers understand that they have to participate in market-led production, then they're actually holding a stake in the supply chain. They're understanding what the market actually wants and producing it according to that and helping to reduce issues such as wastage and directly focusing on satisfying the market. So
If that's how you define equity, I totally agree with you.
because they're playing a part,
Sure,
you know,
then I
then
totally
they're
agree with you,
contributing
yeah.
and they're getting their share out of the supply chain.
Well,
That's what I would say.
Then I agree with you. I think-
Okay. Then private sector is there to innovate and really address the needs that are there, like to seal up the pressure points, if I would say. So if the government has laid down the systems and processes, so how does the private sector actually innovate around delivering value? And that is where innovations such as the Kickstart, such as the IDE come on board, and MFARM to satisfy that whole loop and connecting the farmers directly to the market. So government systems and processes, and also utilizing these innovations, I will say.
Okay, so far so good, thank you. Nicole, we haven't got to you yet. You're a researcher and you publish. What haven't you put in your publications that would answer these questions? What is hidden between the lines of your written output?
I noticed that one of the things you left out of your categories of actors was information providers. And so from a research point of view, I was actually just mulling over the fact that you've excluded us, and this is supposed to be inclusive growth here, Phil. And actually, but I do mean that in a serious way, in the sense that I think that one of the things that's often left out is that issue of reducing risk through information provision. And we take it for granted. You know, we publish papers and we take it for granted that that's going to just play a role somehow. But I think maybe we need to structure that into these processes and part of those categories and actors. And one of the things that we're trying to do under ILSSI is looking at what the information gaps are in not necessarily, yeah, in a sense, in each of these ways, like, you know, what are the potential benefits? What are the roles of the different actors? What are the risks, and how can the different actors reduce those risks? So, you know, I think that there's an important gap here around information that we're not really discussing, and I think that also helps to balance some of that risk, and investment in information so that the private sector can make decisions. Because there's this idea that if you just tell people that, oh, this is a great opportunity, the private sector will go, oh, yay, and they'll just jump in. But if that was the case, they'd already be there, right? So, you know, what is it that can entice them to take on some of that risk? And I think some of it is supplying those, you know, filling those gaps in information so that they have a sense of the size of the market, where the good entry points are, and what their role can be.
So then, in closing this discussion of the cluster about concepts, you have in fact invited another question. I used to work for the IFC, and one of the big things that we had to deal with was large irrigators that came through the door saying, I have bought an irrigation pump and I've bought irrigation equipment, and I now find that my yields are going down and my costs are going up. What have I done wrong? And what we said at the bank was, you didn't come to us first, give us $20,000 and we would have got the right equipment for you. You two guys, you're selling equipment. Do you feel responsible for delivering the right product?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we need to deliver something that's absolutely appropriate, that's affordable, that's robust, that's not going to break down. We can't gamble with the lives of the buyers by telling them something's good and they take it home and it breaks in the first, you know.
So unlike our clients in those days, you didn't buy the biggest squirt that the salesman could sell you. Tim?
Great question. I think we spend a lot of effort on farmer education, of course, and getting that purchase so that the product is actually used. So, yeah, I mean, we work with different manufacturers of drip irrigation, not only our own, and I think we believe in all the products we sell. But we've also seen tremendous failure out there. We've seen people that buy the product and it's not being used to the proper end. And so the investment in the front end to get the product understood and used properly is absolutely essential. And you need a network, you need a cluster, a critical mass of people before that becomes economical. And then looping back to this question about who bears the cost, you know, I think sometimes we have such enthusiasm about markets, especially in this country, that we sometimes forget about the hidden hand of government in our own agricultural system here and what that does to drive demand and sales. And then, you know, we go overseas and we expect the markets to work like magic. And, you know, what we all want at the end of the day is these virtuous cycles of agriculture where the seed seller, the fertilizer, the you know, intermediary transporter, the end market is there, and then the information and the extension that delivers that information, that everybody's kind of getting paid along the chain. And when that virtue happens, then it grows. I think the irrigation aspect of it, though, I mean, we absolutely spend a lot of time making sure the product is well understood.
Thank you. Let's move on to the production cluster. I'm going to throw them at you first of all, Nicole, because you're working with the farmers and there's a certain perceptual issues here. Is it true, as was stated at the World Bank Forum, and Martin, please forgive me for this, is it true, as stated at the World Bank Forum on water for food, that mechanical pumps give a greater return on investment than manual alternatives? Are farmers better off going it alone rather than combining their efforts? I'm thinking, Neville, of the example we saw in Ethiopia when there was an excellent rollout of irrigation for chilies, and a contact farmer had spread the message to many farmers around him, but none of them were combining to dry and grind the chili. And does the concept of economies of scale apply to small farmers? And if so, how? Nicole.
All three questions, or all? Okay, so when it comes to the issue of mechanical pumps, if you really, I mean, if you're looking at the internal rate of return, you know, the cost benefit that we've done would suggest that mechanical has a higher internal rate of return than the manual.
I can hear a but coming.
And the reason I'm saying that is because when we talk about return on investment, there's different purposes of putting pumps in. And one of the things that we, it's clear that there are multiple benefits from investing in pumps. So if you're thinking in terms here of an individual investor as being the farmer, there could be different returns on investment that you're looking for. But same for a development partner, and it could be same for a contract farming arrangement where a company invests in pumps for different reasons for their farmers or with their farmers or offers those on credit to the farmers. Improving health and productivity through, provision of clean water. So it's not to say that there is never a case to be made for a more labor-intensive pump. But if you're speaking purely, internal rate of return, yeah, the research results compared to the other pumps that we looked at was higher for the mechanical. Do you want me to move on?
No, Martin, you must have a rebuttal for that.
I do. To begin with, the data that we looked at the other day was for bucket irrigation versus motorized pumps. It wasn't for mechanical pumps. It was bucket irrigation. Secondly, it showed, if you looked at it in detail, that the overall incomes, yes, were higher for motorized pumps, but the initial return on investment was higher for bucket irrigation even than the motorized pumps. And the feeling of security of the farmers was also higher for bucket irrigation than it was for the irrigated pumps. That's the data we looked at the other day. And the truth is that what we've found is that certainly high-quality human-powered pumps, and it very much depends on what pump you're analyzing, just like any technology, there's good, there's bad, there's best. We found obviously much, much better, 8 to 10 times more productive than bucket irrigation. And it very much also depends on the price of petrol, the risks around petrol, the cost of getting it and storing it, as to whether human-powered pumps or petrol pumps are going to be better for an individual farmer. Solar obviously has some very nice advantages. You don't have that labor cost, and obviously that labor cost can be very high. But it very much, again, depends on the opportunity cost of the labor, which I don't know how you calculate it, but you have to really look at what it really is, not just putting a price to it. And it's often very low in the rural area.
Thank you. The whole issue of the opportunity cost of labor, the executive committee did identify that as the elephant in the room at one stage during the ILSSI, so thank you for pointing that out. We haven't yet touched on the going it alone and economies of scale. I'm going to ask this to Linda. I'm going to refer this also to Kurt, because I mentioned the Chile example, and I'm thinking also of small farmers in Egypt, where water management is a key issue, and economies of scale, including that land consolidation. There are great examples where farmers hate it until they try it. Once you've got economies of scale and land consolidation, your water management density, as I call it, goes down because you have one turnout for 100 hectares instead of one turnout for 1 hectare on a public irrigation scheme. Plus you get marketplace leverage when you buy your inputs and sell your outputs. But I know that cooperatives, which grab some of that, aren't always popular in Africa because they have a history as a top-down instrument that have failed. What do you think about cooperatives as a way to combine farmers' efforts and to achieve economies of scale? I'm going to ask you that from the donor's perspective in a minute, Kurt, but Linda first.
So cooperatives were actually popular at some point until they were used for political gain. So then they started to disintegrate because there were issues around financial distribution and, as you've said, the top-down management. So what we have done, and from experience, farmers, as long as you have shown them where the economic value is, they will come together. And part of what we do is to aggregate and help the farmers understand that there's a big quantity somewhere that will be useful enough, or it will attract the buyers to come down straight to them and purchase. So then farmers start to consolidate, to have peer-to-peer conversations, and they start to look at the best performing farmer and start to follow and try to adopt whatever they're doing in order to get the high profits. So yes, the farmers are consolidating, but not through government, but through private and private effort, I will say, like community kind of effort. And that is only when they have understood where the market is or where they're able to make their money, whether it is through selling the produce or coming together for motorcycle kind of businesses, as in just where the business is, the farmers will come together. That is from experience. Whether they should go at it alone, I do not know that it's completely correct, because then when they're moving their produce from one county to another, we have taxes that are charged towards the farmers. And eventually the produce that they're trying to move becomes more expensive to the consumers. So then we're looking at how we making food affordable, how we making this trade for the farmer more affordable, and that is where the government comes in. So how is the government also being fair to the private businesses such as the farmers and the rest of the people who are involved in the supply chain? So yeah, so yes, they're going at it alone by aggregating and bringing the efforts together to serve a market or a need. But still the government comes in always. You cannot escape it, especially in Africa, I would say that.
Thank you, Linda. So then what's the view from the donor's cockpit on this, Kurt?
Linda said it more eloquently, but made the same point I was going to make. I think top-down, government-registered cooperatives obviously have a pejorative, difficult history in Africa. Ground-up associations, whether they're sort of officially registered as cooperatives or not, have a much better history. So I think there's no, certainly I have no dispute on that. I will take the power of having the microphone to come back just a little bit on the question of the information, though, and would urge that, and AID does not do a very good job of this, I think, but urge that we really approach information itself from a demand-driven perspective. I'm not sure that more studies translates into more uptake by the private sector, and so I think we really need to do a better job up front of figuring out what information is needed, how can it be presented in manageable ways that a busy businessman can understand and use in a more practical way. So I'd like to just
Thank you. Let's close this cluster with one question for Tim. Does IDE sell to cooperatives or just individuals?
Yes, I think we have several examples of selling to cooperatives, but and we even have one multiple use system which serves a village of 16,000. So we do a few larger scale efforts. You know, by and large, our theory of change, our development effort, is based on individuals. It is based on the power of an individual to buy a single product, manage that single product, and transform their farm. So I would say yes, we have some examples, but without that entrepreneurship, typically found more at the individual level, we don't do as much.
But now we have a game changer. Presumably IDE will adapt its business model.
I don't follow you.
Well, we're now talking about the small farmer not as a problem but as an opportunity, and we're talking about economies of scale. Is that a new market for you?
I will tell
can comment one thing.
That's not to
No,
say
we've got to
we
move
don't.
on.
That's
Yes.
not to say we would not work with large groups to both sell, you know, huge numbers of products. It's just that the individual driver of change is a single person and a single.
Sorry, we've got to move on. I see Nicole
Sorry.
itching. Sorry.
Yeah, there's just a couple of points. One is I think cooperatives can be approached from different points of view, and that there's some benefits to be gained from cooperatives, particularly when you're talking about natural resources, because you could use a cooperative also for sustainable management of that resource. So, and I think it's important as we have the private sector discussion not to lose sight of the sustainability issue. Sorry, and the second point is when we've been looking at some of the business model development for smallholder farmers, cooperatives is one of the ones that we definitely look at because some of the companies that run outgrower schemes actually prefer making contracts with cooperatives and not individuals.
Right.
So I think that the cooperative issue, I don't think we can have this discussion without seriously considering it.
Okay, Martin, no, you haven't time. Sorry. Let's hope you can find space in the next. Finance and trade. There's a lot of questions here. Let's keep it moving because I want to close with a quick takeaway from you. But finance and trade. How to protect investors, lenders, and producers against the shifting sands of policy. This is important. This comes up in the literature. A lender lends to a farmer for a crop diversification program based on a policy. All of a sudden, halfway through the lifetime of the loan, the policy changes, the produce has no market, and the loan tanks. Where, if anywhere, along the value chain, now let's leave that one out because we've got this one before. What's the best way to align incentives with risks? What's the best way to connect small producers with markets? Two examples. When I was working in Zambia about 15 years ago, the farmers already were making $350 per hectare per month selling to freight consolidators who said, please grow beans for me, this is how much I'm going to pay for it. So the market did that. And the market, I was recently actually a tourist in Eastern Congo and saw some of the most unbelievably productive land that I've ever seen outside of China and Vietnam because of the East African community as a market and because of Goma as a market. Not a single donor program in sight. This is a tough one. How important or sustainable are specialist markets like fair trade and other certification or branding schemes? Because they have their critics. Who's going to take that one first? That cluster. Martin. Keep it brief because we're running out of time.
I mean, I think specialist markets like fair trade are fairly small. I mean, we're talking about selling to wealthy, well-informed people who are willing to pay an extra margin. They're absolutely worth filling. Someone should fill those, but they're not going to be the large-scale solution. Organic is growing a little bit more quickly than fair trade, and we're starting to see demand even in developing countries for organically grown. Now, of course, most smallholders grow organically anyway because they can't afford the pesticides. The other thing which would be interesting to think about is a sort of smallholder produced brand. Is there any way to get some kind of, maybe not as high as the margin you pay for organic, but maybe a margin that people would be willing to pay somewhere between organic and fair trade, but for smallholder produced? Maybe that could be interesting to support.
Yeah, we did see an example at the World Bank thing of a locally branded, one lady was branding her own stuff ready for the market. Okay, the shifting sands of policy. Kurt, can you speak about that?
Sure, just quickly on certifications. I do know a little bit about that from the coffee sector where I work fairly extensively, and the trend is really going the other direction. Producers constantly complain that the cost and the effort involved in certification does not get paid back in the price differentials that they get. So it's really going the other direction. There's something like almost 50 different certifications in the coffee sector, and it just creates a lot of confusion and a lot of gain, with some exceptions. There are some exceptions. On the policy, well, we basically have three tools. You can do analysis, and I would argue that analysis needs to include political economy, and then you present the analysis and hope that the government comes to their senses about good policy. The U.S. government doesn't always do that too well. So then you've got dialogue, and then you've got pressure. Those are your kind of three ways to influence policy, and all of them are more or less appropriate depending on the individual situation. But
okay,
yeah,
now ladies, you've been working very much at the sharp end with the farmers. How do you align incentives with risks? Where is the intersection point with decreasing risks and increasing incentives?
Actually, I'd like to hear from Linda on this as well, because we do it from a research point of view, so we share risk, whereas, you're working on it more.
I found that working with smallholder farmers can be a bit tricky because there is the culture around trade which has either encouraged or discouraged certain kind of behavior. So you'll find that there's encouragement for farmers to work towards profit, yes, but also there's discouragement of farmers working together or to fulfill the market, because once a farmer gets a contract and you're telling them, look, fulfill 400 tons of potatoes per week for me. So a farmer commits. But then you find that there's this host of issues, and we have to look at the farmer, yes, as a business, but also as a human being. So the farmer has issues such as health, education for their children, all these kind of emergencies that crop up. And they want some sort of reassurance that, you know what, in as much as I'm investing in agriculture, there's somebody else I'm sharing the risk with, and that I can be able to be liquid. So the kind of risks that we've seen are those that crop up from emergency situations with the farmers. So instead of the farmer side selling, can we come up with a way in which we can either make it easier for them to use the data that they have in terms of farm management to get some sort of cheaper premium to get insurance, Can we look at those? Can we use our data to be able to de-risk the farmer from the efforts that they've put in their trade? I believe that is one way to look at it.
In the interests of progress.
Yeah.
You're a purveyor of information. And Tim, you must have information in your sales packs. Can you two wrap up this cluster and then we'll move to the end?
Yeah, I mean, as one of the things that we've done under the ILSSI project is price analysis. So what we've done is we've looked at prices every 2 weeks across the year. And, we'll do that for 2 or 3 years in a row. And then we actually share that back with the farmers so that they're able to plant to try to capitalize, to try to, get that opportunity for the best prices. So, showing that data related to prices has been one way of reducing risk for them.
Okay.
But I think the other is around weather, and it comes back to some of the insurance, but it's definitely about, whether it's analyzing dry spells, whether it's providing longer term, weather information, whether it's providing daily weather information.
Okay. Can we, in the
Yeah.
interest of progress? Tim, I just want to turn that question on its head, because you take risks, you have incentives, and you're on the retail, you're on the supply side. How do you reconcile your risks and your incentives?
I think the number one incentive for a farmer to wake up on a spring morning and do something completely different, try a new technology and do something different, is knowing that there's a market there that's going to buy his product. And sometimes that can be a little bit difficult to see. I worked in Nigeria a long time, and when the Nigerian government subsidized rice mills and the production of rice mills, that changed the demand for higher-end rice, and so prices went up. So I see the incentives coming from external markets, if at all possible, and that should lead before the production subsidies come in. If you combine the two, the market demand with a production subsidy, let's say a voucher that's going to give you half off fertilizer or half off a drip irrigation kit that's issued by the government, and there are systems to do this now, then I think you can get some really nice cycles of growth.
Excellent, thank you. All right, well, that concludes the panel discussion. Just by way of signing out, very quick, one-sentence takeaway from each of you, and I want to give you a little quick encouraging story after that. Kurt, one sentence.
Consult early and often with the private sector.
Wow. Nicole.
For me, it's around the issues of both economic and environmental sustainability, and looking at different ways of achieving that and sharing risk.
I'll just say that, and building on my last comment, the incentive to grow more food in sub-Saharan Africa has never been higher due to the global food crisis, and that will drive change.
Martin.
And I'll just say we need to be thinking about how to scale up as quickly as we can. I think we know that smallholder irrigation is having all these impacts. We know what the constraints are. We need to have smart government and donor subsidies to overcome those constraints and get them in place, build the market demand, lower those risks, and make it happen.
Okay. Linda.
We should look at a one-stop channel to give all the information about the markets, about prices, the way we're looking at it, so that the farmer has trusted channels to which they can be able to move faster and to invest better in their enterprise.
Thank you. Let me then just close with an example that shows you the massive impact that a small investment in agricultural water management can make. In western Madhya Pradesh, I went to a village that were right on the border with Rajasthan, very, very dry. That community had been scratching out a living with a line of maize here or there. The Rajiv Gandhi Watershed Mission dug a few seepage troughs, one seepage tank. Very simple, took a few days. I was there, I counted 27 marketable crops. They had a half-acre fish pond that they leased out, and they still had water left over to sell in the market. That's what we can do. Thank you, everybody, and big hand to the panel.